Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever in the world you're joining us from, whether you're with us live or watching this later. Welcome to the 10th Oxford University Press History Book Club meeting. My name is Susan Ferber, and I'm one of the history editors at OUP. On behalf of my colleagues, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. For those of you who have participated in the previous book club meetings, featuring works ranging from Norse America to the American War in Afghanistan, from Mahjong to Charlie Brown, welcome back. If you didn't get to see these live, you can find all the recordings for the previous meetings on OUP's YouTube channel, which I put the link for in the chat. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, here's a little background. Reading and talking about books in a group has a long tradition. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the first secular American reading circles, or conversations, a precursor to book clubs, were begun. They required little more than a thirst for knowledge and a desire to discuss it with like-minded individuals, to talk about challenging ideas, to learn together, and hopefully to have some fun along the way. That's the spirit in which this book club was founded. What we lack in the intimacy of a small group, I hope we can gain in creating a broad community of readers. This book club gives you the chance to directly interact with the authors, as well as to continue the conversation online if you wish, with others in the book club. Every meeting features 2 OUP authors in conversation, traditionally the writer of a new book with the author of one of our backlist titles. Over time, we aim to share histories from around the globe, from a variety of periods of history, and from many different authorial perspectives. It's a real treat today to be able to bring you 2 very new OUP books on the French Revolution, and to have these authors, who were working at the height of their powers, with us in person. They are, of course, bookshelves upon bookshelves of popular and scholarly titles that have been written about this truly world-changing event and its impact on France and beyond from the 18th century on. These complementary titles bring the focus to Paris and present history on a scale where readers feel an intimate sense of living through transformative events as they unfolded. These authors wear their decades of learning lightly in these pages, and it's been just a pleasure to immerse as a reader in their prose. Without further ado, let me briefly introduce our books and authors today. Timothy Tackett is Professor of History Emeritus at the University of California, Irvine. He is the author of many books, including The Coming of the Terror in the French Revolution, When the King Took Flight, and one of the books we're discussing today, The Glory and the Sorrow, A Parisian and His World in the Age of the French Revolution. He's joined by Colin Jones, Emeritus Professor of History at Queen Mary, University of London, who is currently visiting professor at the University of Chicago. He too is a very prolific author, whose books include Paris, Biography of a City, Versailles, and today's book, The Fall of Robespierre, 24 Hours in Revolutionary Paris, which has been shortlisted for the prestigious Duff Cooper Prize in the UK. Tim and Colin are going to speak for about 35 minutes, and then the floor will be open to your questions. You can start putting them in the chat on Crowdcast or on Facebook anytime, and my colleague Erin Cox will bring up as many as she can after the initial conversation. You can also go to the hashtag at OUP History Twitter feed and comment using the hashtag at OUP History Book Club. Welcome, Tim and Colin, and thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Susan, and thank you everyone for showing up today. And hello, Tim. Thank you for being there, and I'm really looking forward to talking about our 2 books together. Well, you know, we've both written a book just out now on the French Revolution. There's so much that's been written on the French Revolution, and yet what is striking about our books is that they both take a very small and very specific and very small, in some ways, angle on it. You looking at an individual, a really ordinary sort of guy who and his experience in the French Revolution, and me concentrating very, very literally, really, on one day in the course of this revolution, which did last quite a few years after all. So I guess one way in is to say, you know, what our projects are about and why they're worth doing and why we thought they were worth doing. So your biography of Adrien Joseph Colson, you know, who was he? Why is he the sort of person that you wanted to write a biography about?
Well, thank you, Colin, and thank you, Susan, and everybody who helped organize this discussion, which I'm very much looking forward to. Yeah, I mean, I spent much of my career thinking about large numbers of people. I looked at large numbers of categories. I studied several thousand cahiers de doléances, the statements of grievances. I studied the 1,300 odd deputies to the First National Assembly. I studied the 60,000 priests who were presented but had to take an oath of allegiance to the French Constitution. And it occurred to me it'd be interesting to try to look at one individual. Now, in fact, the vast majority of biographies of people living during the French Revolution relate to political or intellectual elites or to leaders of the revolution. We know far less about the experience of ordinary citizens, without whose support the revolution, especially in its later stages, would have, of course, been impossible. Adrien Colin was a small-time lawyer living in Paris, a business agent for a minor noble family. He never held office. He never published anything. His very existence would have passed out of all memory, except for an amazing thing, a miraculous thing in some ways, the preservation of over 1,000 of his letters written to the man he called his closest friend, living in central France, written from the late old regime through the revolution. They're especially interesting because Colin lived in one of the poorest and most densely populated parts of Paris, which later became a hotbed of political radicalism and the sans-culottes, those members of the lower middle class and middle class who were particularly radical in supporting the revolution. Although Colin himself was well educated and was had a relatively comfortable income, he was hardly wealthy. He'd grown up in a family of artisans in a small town in northeastern France. And he always felt close to the craftsmen and shopkeepers that lived around him, and was able to describe them and talk to them and recount his conversations sometimes with his friend. That's the letters that I'm looking at, 1,000 letters or so, which I eventually got through. Tell us not only about his own revolutionary itinerary, his politicization and his radicalization over time, but also that of the little people living around. So, Colin, why don't you tell us a little bit about your book, 24 Hours in Revolutionary.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that you've done studies on these big numbers of people, and now you're down to one, because I guess if you looked at most of what I've written, I've always tended to write very long durée type of studies. I've done a history of Paris, as Susan was saying, from earliest time, a history of France from the cavemen onwards, you know, so one day is really a very, very different sort of thing, but it is a big day. It's a big day. It's the 9th of Thermidor, year 2 in the new revolutionary calendar. It's the 27th of July, 1794 for most of us. And it's the day on which Robespierre is overthrown. And you know, if you read the history of the French Revolution, you'd probably agree with this. You could do it around 4 major days. The idea of the day, the journée, is such a key one for understanding the revolution, where there's a sudden switch, if you like. And the 4 days would be 14th of July, 1789, fall of the Bastille, you know, when it all kicks off. Then, of course, 18th Brumaire in 1799, when Napoleon comes to power. Usually most people think that's when the revolution ends. We'd certainly pick out the 10th of August, 1792, when the king is overthrown. We move from monarchy to republic. But the other one is the 9th of Thermidor. It's the day which Robespierre is overthrown. He's seen as the man who's overseen the period of, the historians call it the Terror. It marks, if you like, a drift towards, sometimes people see it as a very sharp end of the Terror. And I thought it'd be really interesting to focus on this. So going in small, if you like, but talking about a subject which is big. And in fact, my approach was to go very, very small. After I realized that, in fact, like you, that it may be one day, but there is the hugest amount of documentation on it for reasons I could talk about it, if you like. But I seriously think it must be one of the best documented days in certainly the whole of the revolution, possibly the whole of the 18th century. So you have an enormous amount of stuff to sift through. And what is really exciting about it is, I found, was that you can see the revolution at every level within the city of Paris on that day. You have testimonies from hundreds. Actually, I think that by probably the end, I haven't actually counted them up, but it must be well over 1,000 individuals who give in their own voices a sort of micro narrative of at least a fragment and sometimes quite a lengthy period of the day. So my idea was to go micro, so usually we think of micro history as maybe about a micro place or a micro individual in some ways, like your son, Guy. But this is micro in time, so it's a single day, but which will allow us a new understanding of a key date in the revolution. And really, like the sort of one of the major premises of micro history, you go small, you go as granular, as tiny as you can, because then you will see things in a different light, a different sort of conjunction of facts and opinions and views and all the rest of it. And then you will be able to shift the level, come up to the larger, the more macro level, and say something new and exciting and different about a day which obviously has preoccupied historians for many years. But I'm looking at a sort of history of a single day. You're looking at a longer period. And I wonder, one of the things I was very struck about yours, and you mentioned it, in fact, in your introduction, that you see this person really radicalized over the period of the revolution. I wondered if you could talk about that a bit and talk about how you see how his political views come in, how he comes into the revolution, but how he changes his political views over the period.
Sure. One of the remarkable things I found with Colson, and almost certainly the neighborhood he's living in, is they in no way anticipated the revolution. Colson never uses the word revolution until July of 1789. He revealed no hostility whatsoever against the king, Louis XVI, who he really seemed to venerate, nor hostility toward Orthodox religion, and he appears as really rather a devout person. He seemed to know nothing about the Enlightenment, or at least he certainly doesn't talk about it in his correspondence. And he had no inkling of the financial and fiscal crisis that France was experiencing in the last decade of the old regime in the 1780s. He was stunned by the convocation of the States General, first of the Assembly of Notables, and then the States General during this period we often call the pre-revolution, from 1787 to 1789. And it was really during those 2 years, immediately preceding the revolution, that he was, I think, we might say, politicized. At first, in his letters, he simply described what was going on. And it attached to sort of, but little by little, he began taking his own position and strongly supporting this person or this cause or that person. It was above all the great flood of pamphlets that poured into Paris in late 1788 and 1789, which seems to have energized him and, in a sense, politicized him. These were pamphlets that were written about the coming States General and how it should be organized and what should be discussed. And Colson went every day, or almost every day, to the Palais Royal, the great square, not in central Paris, not very far from where he lived, and browsed among these pamphlets. There were lots of bookstores there. He read some, bought some, and took some back to his friends in his little neighborhood, and there they read them together. Once the revolution began, he was clearly influenced also by discussions of his local National Guard battalion, the militia of his Lombard section of Paris, and by the section meetings themselves. He attended both. He talks about them quite often. And thereafter, we can follow his progressive radicalization, and it's quite fascinating. He embraced the revolutionary organization of the church in 1790, even though he could never have imagined such a thing just a few years earlier. he came to accept the participation of Protestants in this new regime, Protestants about whom he was actually very suspicious, as were his friends and neighbors before the revolution. His view of the king wavered over time, but eventually, after Louis XVI unsuccessfully tried to flee in the summer of 1791, he was captured and brought back. And after he seemed not to fully back the war effort, after the war in April of 1792, he came to ultimately accept, and certainly under the influence of his section, which took the same positions, he came to accept the overthrow of the monarchy and the creation of a republic in the summer of 1792. Thereafter, he would announce his support of Robespierre and marched with his section to help overthrow the Girondin action in the National Convention. It's a remarkable itinerary, and it seems closely, not always, to correspond with that of his section. He didn't always agree with them, but generally he did. So, Colin, I guess I wondered a little bit if you could say a bit more about your up-close approach, and particularly about the way you organized your book. I would say it's a very unusual organization of the book.
Yeah, when I came into this project, I was thinking I was going to write a history of this day. I was pretty determined to do that. But I thought it'd be very conventional in structure and form. And I thought I'd, start with the context, and I'd think about the causes, and then, all the rest of it. And then I'd do the day, and then I'd be onto the aftermath and the consequences. And I actually, when I got into it, I realized that probably wasn't the best way to do it. I should think of a different way of doing it. And what I ended up doing, as you'll see when you look at the book, and it is unusual, it is basically really about 24 hours. And there are 24 essential chapters with a bit of stuff, discussion at the end. The chapters are roughly the same length, and they go from midnight to midnight. So this is a day which really is a day. Everything is focused in on that day. It doesn't mean you can't have flashbacks and talk about what happened before, but the focus will always be on the day. And the reason I got into doing that were two or three reasons, really. One of them is that I realized that although everyone was sort of writes about this, always says, well, it's obvious Robespierre had blown up, people are plotting against him. Parisians weren't going to support him anymore. They were completely disinterested in politics. In fact, it wasn't a predictable day at all. I think if you've been a betting person and you had money to put on which way it was going to go on the day, you'd actually put Robespierre as a winner, because Robespierre at that time, and his opponents in the National Assembly, National Convention, are very aware of that. He's very popular. No, they're not popular. He's a celebrity. He's famous in that sort of way. He's got a lot of support in all the sections of Paris, the local administration, if you like. He's put the mayor in place. The mayor and the national agent, his adjunct, are Robespierre nominees. The commander of the National Guard, which is all the armed force in the city, the convention has the National Assembly has no armed support, whatever. It's actually run by, again, a Robespierre nominee. And moreover, he staffed most of the jurymen and many of the judges of the Revolutionary Tribunal. This is a guy who seemed to have all his cards in his hand. So it soon became apparent that if it was, I was looking at this day, it was what actually happened on the day, which was the really important thing, which explained how something which looked as if it was going to go one way ended up going completely the other way. And what I sort of soon realized when I was doing it that way, that it did allow this you've got this very rich material. It allowed these questions of unpredictability to be followed very closely, and I say up close to individuals, but also to rumors and stories and news that are going around and men and National Guardsmen going around the city, and following them and seeing the moments at which many of them had a choice to make. They could either support Robespierre and what he stood for, the group of people who were arrested with him in the assembly in the middle of the day, or they could, and Robespierre and the commune, the municipal government, which supported him and which came out in insurrection in his support, or they could stick by the National Convention. And what I found was really interesting is that initially many people, before they really knew what was going on, I argue, they had a tendency to support Robespierre and the Commune, and they shifted over the day. So one had to go close, really close, to understand what was going on. And I think, like you, I'm interested in the ordinary people. I think there's sort of three levels to my analysis, really. And it started at the top, I guess you'd say, with Robespierre himself, who's full, what's that day. I wanted to say something different about him. And I think the Robespierre that comes out of this book is a different person from most other Robespierres. We all, as historians, have our own version of Robespierre. I know that. I'm sure you do as well. But for me, he's not someone who's blown up, exploded, sort of burnt out or anything like that. Although he's very, very tense. But who isn't in that period? He is a player. He is someone who has a strategy for going forward. He uses the language of victimization, of self-sacrifice, of impending suicide, and all the rest of it, laying his life on the line. But actually does have a plan for the way forward. That plan involves not moving back to a constitution, but continuing along the same path as he's outlining already in terms of social institutions. And actually, although there's much dispute among historians, that is a way forward that will involve a lot of blood being spilled. There is a sea of blood to be covered as he goes forward. So that's my take on Robespierre. I also wanted to look at the plotters, the people who actually conspired against him. And my analysis, again, doesn't really go with what most people have said. For me, there is no plot prior to the 8th and 9th of Thermidor. There is a lot of hot air, and a lot of let's get together and shall we do this, and a lot of posing and posturing in private. But no one does anything substantial until on the previous day, the 8th of Thermidor, Robespierre goes into the National Assembly and makes this very long and very frightening speech where he's sort of laying down the law and saying that people need to be purged, but without giving a sense of who he wants to get rid of, essentially. And then what happens is that basically everyone is frightened. Anyone who thinks Robespierre has looked askance at them over the previous months feels very, very nervous. And so you get on that evening and really on the next day, a sort of coalition of the very, very frightened, right, left and center get together. And you've got this very unified group who only discover their unity on the day. Some people are going in thinking, we're going to do something today. Most people, even in the National Assembly, they are absolutely gobsmacked by what unfolds before their eyes. This very dramatic scene when Robespierre and Saint-Just and the others are challenged. And so I wanted to follow it around through those people, if you like, and to show the extent to which, for them, the day is very, very improvised, if you like, and it is all in the day. And then I wanted, as I say, to go down into the just the normal career of people who wake up on the 9th of Thermidor and think, well, this is a day like any other. Okay, it's a day in the period of the terror. There will be guillotinings tonight, and there were guillotinings that evening. There'll be problems in the market for the maximum. It'll be a normal day. By the end of the day, they not only know that an ordinary day has turned into an extraordinary day, but the other thing is they know that they have made it an extraordinary day, because that's my other big point coming out of it, that this is a day in which Parisians actually get out on the street and oppose Robespierre and stick up for the National Convention. That is not the story that most historians have told at all, I don't think. But for me, it is a Parisian journée. It's a triumphant day when basically Parisians, in alliance with the deputies in the National Convention, caused the fall of Robespierre. So for me, this is about the fall of Robespierre, more than the end of the terror. But that's the sort of approach, that's a comprehensive, but also very finely granulated approach that I wanted to go in with, to come out with what I hope are sort of quite major findings.
Colin, that's fascinating, and especially the use of all these sources, which I don't know if they've been used before, but certainly I didn't know about them. I wish I had known about them sooner for some of my earlier studies. This is a question that historians always have to ask: to what degree can you trust those sources? Isn't there a lot of special pleading going on? There's a lot of people being killed right afterwards.
Yeah.
Right afterwards. Aren't the people who are reporting, aren't they likely to exaggerate a bit their own pro-convention positions? What do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, we're historians. This is our stock in trade. We know there is not a virgin, innocent document anywhere in the world. So we're always going to be working on it for bias. And undoubtedly, after the date, everyone's sort of saying that, giving their version in a very sort of sweetened way, if you like. What I think are two things I'd say here, really. One is that the volume of material is actually a great help. It means that individual testimonies can often be tested against other testimonies. And so you can actually sort of get a drift, if you like, and you see that some testimonies quite likely to be outliers. I mean, only one of the literally hundreds of reports that the section sent in the days after 9th of Thermidor says, we saw this coming, we've been plotting for years, we knew Robespierre was a terrible person. I just didn't believe, that just doesn't go with the volume of other testimonies. So you've got a lot of that. And the other thing is I try to counterbalance that by actually looking at where people were and what and the circumstances in which they found themselves when they were making choices. So for me, when I was sort of doing this very close analysis, watching people move around the city, rumors, information coming around, and trying to see them making those decisions in that sort of way. So I tried to check, if you like, in that way, in terms of it would be likely that they thought this sort of thing was important. And actually, I think this again is quite a significant finding, really, is that I found there was no correlation between what would you think the political view of someone was on the streets of Paris prior to the 9th of Thermidor and the 9th of Thermidor. So many people, I was surprised to find many people who were even in the vanguard against Robespierre. You would have thought, well, this is a Robespierreist, before 9th of Thermidor. He seemed to be totally sold into the Robespierre type of ideology. So in some ways, I would say it's a sort of situational logic that's going on in allowing people to make this decision. They're sort of faced with this decision one way or the other, and they're sort of just trying to sort of go through the card index in their mind and sort of sort everything out in their mind and make the right sort of decision. But as I say, it is very much about the fall of Robespierre. And I sort of did this thing, I did this little trick for fellow historians that I don't refer to the terror at any stage in the book until actually after the 9th of Thermidor, because as we know, no one uses the term the terror with a capital T before the end of the overthrow of Robespierre. So I thought, as I'm trying to think in what we call actors' categories, the views, the ideas of the people on the ground on the actual day, they didn't know about the terror yet, because in some ways the term had only been invented afterwards. So I tried to see it through their eyes. So it's about the fall of Robespierre, really, in some ways more than the end of terror. And I was actually interested when as we're talking titles, that your title is a very interesting one, the glory and sorrow. And I wonder if you could perhaps talk a bit about that.
Yeah, of course, the glory part of the title is I believe, fairly obvious. Once again, before 1789, neither Colin nor his friends anticipated the revolution. And it was an extraordinary moment when they suddenly realized that things were transforming, that the world was turning upside down. And those who study emotions have argued sometimes that it's the suddenness of events provoking those emotions can often strengthen the emotion. And I think that's certainly what happened in this case. They were stunned. They were absolutely beside themselves with joy that this was happening. And the transformation was performed in many ways during the early days of the revolution. There were the collective oaths in which people got together in wherever, in the open spaces, or sometimes in their churches, in the Colin's church, which was just around the corner, raised their hand and declared their allegiance to the revolution, or the great revolutionary festivals which took place. Colin did not go to the first festival of the Federation. He was worried about it. It was raining. He was afraid he'd get wet. But he watched the people watched the National Guards heading that way through the street below his window. And he did go to the other festivals as he came. It was also the democratic culture that was instilled very quickly, and which virtually all offices and positions of importance were elective. And these are glorious moments, especially again in relation to what had come before. And there's a very touching description of which Colin writes in his letters when he first joined his local National Guard unit. And he ordered a uniform, and he ordered a saber. And the uniform he describes in the greatest detail, all of the colors of the collars and the sleeves and the belt and so on, and every buckle and badge and button he describes in great detail to his friend. He was thrilled by his entry into the National Guard. This whole experience was indeed glorious. The sorrow, on the other hand, refers to really the later stages of the revolution, and it was both personal and political. Partly entailed breakup of his relationship with his noble employers, or at least the cooling off of the relationship. The noble he worked with most closely took another advisor. I think in the context, it's pretty clear that this was a homoerotic relationship between the noble and the advisor. They go off and tour together, France and so on. And Colin nearly loses contact with the family that he supported for so long. The man he'd known since he was a boy. And that's a very sad situation. Probably even more sad, though, it was his breakup with the correspondent that he'd been writing to for so long. And we don't know exactly why this happened in 1793. Almost certainly was political. His friend Lemaitre had come up to Paris probably as an agent national. He had once been, of course, the agent of a nobleman in his village, and agents of the nobleman were not looked at favorably by the local peasantry, and he overreacted. He became more radical in a way, and I think there was this probably the extreme radicalization of his friend probably was at the root and cause of this breakup. But Colin is very sad. What did I do? I don't understand it. There were many friendships broken. Other historians have documented the role of friendship and the breakup of friendships in the revolution, and it certainly was the case with Colin. And perhaps above all, there was dechristianization. Colin was a devout Catholic. He was perfectly ready to adapt to the new revolutionary church, the new revolutionary clergy. He had no difficulty with that. When the revolution turned not just against the organization of the church, but against religion itself, against Christianity itself, he obviously had real problems. In 1793, his pastor, who had served in his parish, was arrested. And not long after, the church was closed down, locked up. The church just around the corner, and he'd gone there for 30 years. And even worse, the church was sold off and torn down for scrap limestone. And he must have heard as he lay dying in his apartment, he must have heard the people picking away and knocking down the stones of Saint Jacques de la Boucherie just around the corner. Now, any of you who know Paris have probably seen the Tour of Saint Jacques, this great Gothic tower right near the Place Châtelet, right in the center of Paris. I never quite knew what that was, but in fact, that was his tower. That was the tower that went with the church. The rest of the church no longer exists. The foundations must be somewhere deep underneath the Rue de Rivoli. So this is a series of blows that he encountered, and unfortunately, he does not talk about his views on Robespierre. What did he think of the night of?
Yeah, I didn't get that far.
I'd love to know what he thought about the 9th of Thermidor. He just.
I think he would have been caught up in the emotion because you're right. That you emphasise the history of emotion very interestingly in your book, and I really like those sections. And but there's so much emotion flowing through the whole of the day. Rage, anxiety, fear, joy. It's a whole sort of roller coaster, and it's up and down. Such a dramatic day with so many turns of events. At one stage, it looked like Robespierre's finished, then he comes back from the dead, and the convention is going to be overthrown, and then the commune is going to be overthrown, and it is overthrown. So the emotion is very important. But on the other hand, what I was also I was not really attracted by those histories of crowd action, the Tainian type, which always emphasized the crowd as an agent, which is suddenly overtaken by its passions and acts in any particular way. For me, I was looking at crowds as made up of ordinary people who we're lucky to have their testimonies of what they said, at least, or claimed that they were thinking or planning or imagining on the day. And so a set of people who are driven by emotion, undoubtedly, and are very, very receptive to rumor. And, news and rumor coming in, flowing right through the day, all the time. I noticed that rumor is something that you talk a lot about. But actually, they are making a rational decision. They're trying to make out the decision which is going to work for them, work for the revolution. And as they're listening, what the type of news that comes through and the narrative, the way in which it's presented is absolutely vital. And at the end of the day, there are two stories coming out. And one's coming out of the commune, out of the ville, and it's saying, poor old Robespierre has been overthrown. The patriot of patriots has been overthrown. Those dastardly people in the convention have to be stopped in their tracks. Robespierre has to be put back. We've got to purge his enemies, get rid of his enemies, and we know who the enemies are, even though they don't. So that's going out, and it's actually being transmitted rather poorly for various reasons of logistics. But then the convention story is actually beautifully summed up, actually, by Barrère. And he says in a proclamation which is going out and which is being put out in the city much more effectively and efficiently by the convention, which is basically, you've had 5 years of revolution. Do you really want to lose? Do you really want to sacrifice all that you've gained in the revolution? I think it's a winning narrative, and it's a narrative that people can respond to, because they realize, yes, we don't want to go back to 1789. It's a sort of moment where they stick up for the revolution and they stick up for the National Convention. It is, after all, a national convention. They're aware of that. There's a sense of that. The commune is the the fighting heart of the vanguard of the revolution. But the nation is still the nation. They are representatives of the nation. They have been elected by universal male suffrage. It is the rule of law. And what is also interesting, I found fascinating really, is that one of the people who has actually, done more than many others in putting that sort of narrative forward in the previous months is Robespierre himself. Because if you look at when Robespierre is overthrowing Danton, but there are lots of other occasions he uses this language, he says sort of the revolution, the cause of the revolution is always more important than any one individual. And actually that he's hoisted by his own petard there, really, because he's basically, at the end of the day, Parisians are being presented with this choice: support this person or support everything that the revolution stands for. Because Robespierre has cut himself off to a very large extent from the people of Paris, he's been hiding away in his lodgings for 6 weeks, has only been coming out, really, accompanied by a sort of bodyguard, moreover, to go to the Jacobin Club meetings of the evening. He's lost that, and people have lost a sort of sense of connection to him. Ultimately, his celebrity, which his enemies were so frightened about, doesn't really work for him, because I think he's lost the aura of celebrity by then. And the narrative which he's done so much to push, that the revolution, the cause is more important than people, whether that person be Danton, or it could be Louis XVI, could be Lafayette, or could be Robespierre. And people are saying that on the night of the 9th of Thermidor, I think.
Yes, well, I think your analysis of why the convention came out on top is really fascinating. In your almost staccato a page-by-page description of what's going on, hour by hour, and sometimes minute by minute. We see this flow of opinion from various parts of the city. Two things, though, that also struck me about the triumph of the convention. One was that they controlled the printing press. They were able to rapidly print out the speech of Barrère and whoever and distribute them. They sent off posters all over the city. And secondly was the sending out of couriers. But now these weren't ordinary couriers. These were couriers dressed up in the incredible costumes that Jacques-Louis David had devised, with great plumed hats and beautiful coats and so on. Those compared with the, I don't know if they were ragtag, but they were probably very ordinary costumes of the people coming from the commune. Guitard de Floribond describes somewhere, I think, it was an elderly gentleman living through these times and was horrified by what was going on the night of Thermidor. Describes the way in which people were competing couriers were coming from all over the city, but the ones that really impressed him, obviously, were these guys with their plumed hats who represented the convention, as you've said. Your stress on emotion and how much was emotion and how much was reason and what was going on. But of course, as we know from neurological studies, there's always a tight link between emotion and reason, between cognition and affect. But looking at Colson and Colson's descriptions of his neighborhood, we can see how important emotion, and especially rumor, undergirding those emotions, were throughout the revolution. There's an oscillation, constant oscillation between hope and fear, between joy and enthusiasm, between pessimism and optimism. It's not a linear development in any. We sometimes forget that there's no foreknowledge. They just didn't know what was happening. And in a quarter, in a neighborhood like that where Colson lived, news was probably even more difficult. This really rather poor, to some extent, disinherited section of central Paris. And if you don't have news, reliable news, sometimes you invent news.
I think that was something that came out in my study, but I think in yours as well, that the sense in which rumors are swirling through and all the time, and the difficulty of ascertaining what is news and what is false news, if you like. And as you
or improvised news, as one social historian has called it, I think, in a wonderful phrase.
But I think, two things you isolate. One is print. So print looks better than a sort of scribbly piece of paper signed by someone who's very excited, Henriot, or the commander of the National Guard or whatever. And then actually someone, as you say, you tend to trust news which comes from a source which looks as if it can be trusted. And I think that's important on the day. I mean, the other thing with rumor, which struck me in your analysis, was how much it's about conspiracy. I mean, conspiracy is the sort of bread and butter, or there's the everyday, commodity of French Revolution in action, isn't it? Would you like to say something a bit about that?
It's a tough question, and one I've grappled with, and other historians have grappled with for several years recently. Why this obsession with conspiracy? I don't think, there were conspiracy fears before the revolution, but I don't think they affected the elites to the extent that they did during the revolutionary period. I think they were mostly a popular phenomenon, but we could argue about that. But very early in the revolution, there is this fear that the nobility has given up so much, have been forced to give up so much. Aren't they going to try to get it back? Isn't there going to be a revenge of some sort? And people begin speculating on that. And there are hundreds of rumors swirling through Colson's neighborhood. Some of them are positive, I suppose one might say, but the great majority of them are negative, of the conspiracy of this sort or that sort. the nobles who were hiring blackguards in the prisons to break out of the prisons and go after all the good patriots, or an army coming in from the north to do much the same thing, or to burn the city. Every Christmas from 1789 to 1793, there's a rumor that there's going to be a terrible uprising of aristocrats in the city, year after year. But in Colson, I find scarcely a letter in which he does not talk about one conspiracy or another. The uncertainty, the confusion, the difficulty in central Paris of getting news, whatever that might be, reliable news is part and parcel to the spread of these rumors and of these rumors of conspiracy. And moreover, there's also the number of betrayals that they've had to confront of great patriots, heroes of the revolution who turned out to be traitors. Lafayette, who went over to the Austrians. Mirabeau was found to be secretly in league with the revolution, or at least with the king. Dumouriez, Louis XVI himself, and later Rousseau, and even Danton, with proven or imagined betrayals. It's not clear to what extent everyone believes this, but in the end, if these people can commit treachery, if you can't trust Danton, if you can't trust Lafayette, who can you trust?
Well, you can't trust him. That's, for me, that's interesting. That's the sort of point of my point. That, people think they can't trust him anymore because he's been saying, all these people, they always betray the revolution. The individual thinks that at the end of the day, however much they've done for the revolution, like Danton undoubtedly did, at the end of the day, they think they're too big for their boots and they will go against the revolution. They have to be overthrown. And the conspiracy thing, I thought, again, is really interesting because it saturates the discourses on both sides of the camp on the 9th of Thermidor. Clearly, after the event, it's all the conspiracy of Robespierre, etc., which, I have certain about. But if you look at Robespierre, he is completely obsessed with conspiracy, even as I've suggested, that I don't think there is a genuine conspiracy beforehand. He does, on the famous speech of the 8th of Thermidor, he's accusing everyone of everything, that's bad in the revolution. And he speaks allegedly for 2 hours, so 120 minutes. I counted up the number of times he uses some version of the word conspiracy or faction or conspirator or whatever. It's 100 times. So he says almost every minute he is saying the word conspiracy. This is sort of forcing people down people's throats. So they can read the rooms really. They know that something bad is coming. There's something that there will be victims. There will be blood will be spilled before before very long. So this conspiracy, I think, actually this conspiracy language actually sparks and mobilizes a conspiracy. Suddenly on the night of the 8th and 9th, people are thinking, yeah, he is serious. He's going to attack us. We better stop him. So I think that conspiracy is not just something that's floating free always. You can see where it has actually crystallized, where suddenly it actually originates, if you like, as well. So.
Perhaps that I once tried to. Here's Aaron. We'll have to talk more about that, Colin, on another occasion.
No, you can feel free to continue. I didn't mean to interrupt. We had a couple of questions from the audience, but your conversation is so rich and interesting that I hated to interrupt. But
I just wanted to finish. Let me just finish that. I tried to quantify the references to conspiracy, I don't know, a decade or so ago, and I found that it increases very rapidly after. There's not much talk of conspiracy before July of 1789. There really isn't, especially among the elites. And then it increases only slowly at first, and then it takes off. And there's the idea of this grand conspiracy that comes in, especially under the Legislative Assembly, which everybody is united against us. And everything bad that happens in the revolution can be linked to one conspiracy or another. So yes, this by the time of the Ninth of Thermidor, everybody has thought about the problems of conspiracy. And it's little wonder that they're ready to accept that Robespierre too may have been involved in a conspiracy. And if Danton could be a blackguard, if Lafayette could be a blackguard, why not Robespierre?
Wow. Well, that sort of is a nice way to sort of lead into our first question, which is, what in your research and in the course of writing of each of your books, what was something that you discovered that you were surprised by, that maybe nobody had written before or anything like that? Yeah.
I tell you, I could genuinely say I was genuinely gobsmacked, as we say, by one thing which I realized quite soon, and it was about the people of Paris, which, as I say, I turned into one of the heroes of the book in some way. Honestly, nearly all the literature on the people of Paris give this view that basically they're disenchanted with politics, that Robespierre and the Communist Public Safety pushed them out of political action so far. They become depoliticized. And so although they are initially much pro-Robespierre on the night, by midnight, they've all gone home. Basically. And I soon started realizing that, well, some of them might have gone home to sleep, but most of them stayed on the streets. And many people who were sleeping were actually mobilized. And in fact, what one found was a huge mobilization and sort of counter-mobilization, because many people who were supporting the commune go over to the other side, literally join the other side and move against the commune. So for me, that was sort of absolutely amazing. And it made me want to tell the story in terms of them, if you like, rather than the high political level, but to tell it in the way of the Parisians as well. But so that really was a marker in the way in which I told the story, as well as what the sort of key findings would be.
Colson's battalion of the Lombards, he wasn't in the RC, he was in the battalion of the Lombards, had been, I don't know if Colson was there, but the National Guard from the Lombards was certainly in the Place de la Commune, supporting the commune. And then they gave up and they went home, and they ended up joining, turning around. As they were leaving, they turned around and went with Léonard Bourdin and attacked the commune. So things are really hectic and really.
Tim, what was the most surprising thing? I mean, do you think this guy is representative of others, or did you feel at the end of the day that you didn't? He was a sort of extraordinary figure.
Well, who is representative or not? I mean, it's very hard to say. As I said, even your 150 accounts of the Ninth of Thermidor from around Paris, are they typical? Are they transparent of what people had actually thought at the time? Anyway, I think he was. He seems to. I have been able. Most of the documents from this section of the Lombards have been lost, were burned in 1871 by the Communards. But there are a few, and in general, it's pretty clear that Colson and his section were in agreement. So I think that's clear. On the other hand, was the fact that he is so devout, such a strong Christian or Catholic, is that unusual? I'm not sure, actually. I think we've underestimated the importance of Catholicism, even among the sans-culottes. And there's a wonderful description of, I think it's the midnight mass in the local church, or the Easter Pentecost celebration in that same church, in which the sans-culottes, and he uses the word sans-culottes, are all in attendance, and they put a guard outside the church to make sure no municipal figures try to come in and break it up. Now, what is the nature of that religious belief? Is it simply, popular custom? How devout is it? I don't know. But there are many ways that we can deal with this question, and we just deal with it.
Can I ask as well, because I can see that we're probably getting towards the end of time, because we both started by saying this was something new for us. You're doing this one person, and me doing just the one day. And I was thinking, okay, we hope that it worked and it would be for the readers to decide. But did you enjoy the challenge? Because if I can start off on that, I totally loved it. I mean, I just thought it was so interesting, and giving myself this challenge of, writing a narrative about which I discovered an enormous amount, but telling it in this 24 hours a day, it just actually brought things out in terms of creativity and imagination, which would have stayed locked up forever, I think, if I hadn't had to give myself. So I loved it. I found I got very passionate about.
I love the writing process. The actual research process was a little more arduous. I wasn't in Paris, to do that research. I had to go to Châteauroux. I don't know if you've ever been to Châteauroux.
No.
It's nowhere. It's a nowhere town. And I spent weeks down there going through all these letters, and that was arduous. And I expect you too, Colin. Maybe fun is not quite the word to describe your long and arduous plodding through all those archives in the National Assembly or wherever. But as you emphasize, it's the writing that's the most fun. Both of us, I think. And you use the word fun. Historian using the word fun in acknowledgements. Okay.
Well, maybe our last question, we have just a couple of minutes, but maybe our last question could be maybe about the fun of writing. So both of you are such incredible storytellers, and how much as a historian can you use some imaginative recreation? How much do you rely on facts? And maybe can you say just a couple of lines about that process, or what do you sort of envision as you're writing?
Well, I think again, I guess I'm repeating myself here, but the historian's craft is not all fun. It is not all storytelling. It entails careful tracking down of evidence, of analysis, of interaction with the scholarly community, and so on. And we write articles that most people wouldn't understand and find extremely boring. But on the other hand, I always have felt that we have a responsibility to make some of our discoveries more accessible to the public, to the broader public. And as we just said, that's in a way the most agreeable part of the whole process. Imaginative recreations, yes. We both indulge in those, Colin, I think, in our books.
Yeah, no, I think I'm trying to get into the head of everyone who was alive on the even if they weren't involved, what they were up to and all the rest.
Normally we like to say, we like to think we put a might
yourself in these.
Have said, or it would seem that he said, or thought, or whatever, but I don't know if we always do that. Some of the most wonderful descriptions in Colin's books are of Robespierre in the Commune just before his death, thinking over what's he doing there, what is he, why is he, what's he going to do next. I thought that was a really great aspect in the book. And of course, we have no documents whatsoever
about what he was thinking about. So that is very speculative.
That's creative. That's imaginative. Creative imagination, I guess. Okay. But historians are not novelists. We're not supposed to be.
Right. You're basing it in fact, so there's some, but trying to get in the head of the absolutely.
I can say on that, if we have a moment, just to say that was one reason I didn't have footnotes, because I thought I wanted people to read it as if it were a fiction. So I put all the notes at the back and didn't have even ones and twos in, but I had them identified in other sorts of ways. So I thought, well, obviously, if you're writing in this way, you're going to get hammered by your colleagues if you're not really grounded for all the things that you're speculating about. But actually, most general readers don't want to know the fact. They want to believe it's there and that they can trust in the historian. And if they want to, they can follow up a particular thing. But
they just want to know the truth.
The story to win.
Right.
Yeah, and I would recommend to anybody that's a serious historian to read those notes, because they're wonderful. There's 60 pages of notes, I think, or something like that. And I had great fun as a professional historian reading Colin's notes. Yes.
Well, thank you both so much. Colin, Tim, thank you. This was such a great conversation. Thank you for being a part of our OUP History Book Club. And thank you to everyone for watching.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.